All right. We will now open the Estacada City Council workshop to talk about housing needs and analysis. So I'm supposed to hand this off, I think, to Matt and Taylor. So I will start off with you two and you can go into it.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Hi, everybody. I think Matt Hasty here with, I guess it's not Angelo Planning Group, or is it APG MIG now?
MIG APG.
MIG
Yeah.
APG. Lots of letters. Yeah, so he'll be probably doing most of the presentation, but yeah, I just want to say up front that we're really hoping to address, or at least start addressing, any concerns or priorities, or really just thoughts and ideas that you're having at this point in the process. We are looking at adoption hearings happening in July, maybe August, and ideally we'll get to work through all of the kind of kinks and any issues that the council and community members are bringing up, and try to craft this in a way that addresses those things. And so all of that input is great to have ahead of time, because it takes time to change stuff and draft stuff up. So yeah, thank you all for being here and engaged, and I'll hand it over to Matt.
All right, thanks, Taylor. And I am going to share my screen. Let's see. All right, can everybody see that okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, I'm also gonna try to just make my screen with you all a little bigger so I can see everybody's face while I'm talking. Okay, and apologies if I'm kind of like looking over to the side, because that's where my monitor is with the presentation, and I didn't move it, so it was like in front of or behind you for tonight. So yeah, I'm gonna kind of walk through a presentation. I guess before I kind of get started on the content, even though I put the first slide up, I'll say that I have a fair bit of information to provide. I won't go into nearly as much detail as the memo that we sent out to y'all. I'll probably talk pretty fast. I'll try to hit the high points. As Taylor said, would love to hear sort of any and all comments that you have, particularly, I guess, yes, I support that, or I have some concerns about that, or kind of a lot of concerns about that, whatever it may be, or if you have suggested changes in sort of the initial priorities we've identified, I would love to hear that as well. And when I talk about specific strategies, I'll kind of note what the initial priority is. I will also try to kind of note some of the things that we heard from our technical advisory committee when we met most recently. So I'll try to cover that. So just kind of a quick recap on where we are in the process. That's what this slide shows. So we have sent out to you all a draft of preliminary recommended strategies. These are really aimed in large part at a couple of things. One, kind of expanding housing choices and really trying to reduce some barriers that we think probably make it difficult in some cases to develop housing types that the initial work we did show are needed in Estacada, but aren't being built to a large degree. So expanding housing choices and types is one, addressing cost and affordability is another, but I will say that a lot of these strategies are not going to guarantee that housing is affordable to people in the lowest, or even sometimes kind of moderate or just below the median income. But they can help. They can help reduce the costs of developing housing, and they can make certain types of housing simply kind of financially feasible for developers to produce, or builders or homeowners if they're converting something. So, but I don't want you to get the impression that these are all around kind of building housing for people with the lowest incomes, or even kind of below median income in some cases. So I just want to be kind of clear about that. So with that, I'm going to kind of jump into this. And then again, please just raise your hands physically or with the little raise your hand function, and just let me know if you have comments or questions as we move through. And I'll apologize right now if I'm talking real fast as I do this presentation. So Just to start out, one of the members of our team, Brendan Buckley from Johnson Economics, had conversations with several developers and builders as we were also working on these strategies. Just kind of a couple of highlights from those conversations that he had. There were sort of two major challenges that those folks identified in terms of kind of expanding, again, variety of housing choice and types in Estacada. So one, combination of high building costs, particularly right now, just generally, but particularly right now as construction costs have risen, land prices have risen, is that the combination of those and the rents needed to cost effectively develop certain types of housing really just makes it challenging to build certain types of housing there. You're not alone in this regard. It's the same in other places. And that policies that can do things that help lower the costs of building housing and also just address some of those barriers are going to make it more feasible to then cost effectively build some of those types of housing that you're not seeing right now. And particularly standards around what we talk about as middle housing. So duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, things of that nature. Certain types of development standards in your code probably make it pretty tough to build some of those types of housing. And those are particularly lot size requirements, to some degree parking requirements. They can make it impractical to build certain size or configurations of lots. And so a number of the strategies that I'm going to talk about, are around those types of standards. And again, I'm going to hit the highlights, but we started out with some pretty specific recommendations in some parts of that memo. Our next job, because that's a draft memo, our next task is to go into even a little more detail on particularly the strategies related to development code amendments and to actually identify specific code amendments to implement those strategies. In other cases, we would basically provide a little more detail on, for instance, the financial strategies. What are the steps you need to go through to implement a strategy like that? So that's kind of where we're going next. And there will be plenty of additional opportunities to talk about this stuff before we get to, as Taylor said, adoption hearings sometime this summer. So we're, I wouldn't say quite in the early stages, but maybe the middle stages on this project in terms of the strategy stuff. So I'm not going to talk too much about comprehensive plan amendments tonight. There's a fair bit of information in the memo about that. You'll see that stuff later because one of the outcomes of this process is to update the housing chapter of your comprehensive plan, and we'll come back to you with some specific policy amendment language around that. So I thought I'd kind of not spend a lot of time focusing on that and spend more time focusing on these other strategies, which we've kind of split up into these 4 categories that you see here. In each case, we've identified some preliminary priorities, and I think we talked about those even a little bit last time when I just kind of brought this menu of stuff to you. So I'll kind of flag those. And again, if you have comments on those priorities, please let us know if you think something should be lower, higher, or not. So in terms of land supply strategies, one of those is to rezone land. That's definitely something that we think is going to be warranted. We gave this an initial medium priority. I'd call it more like medium high, simply because you have a shortage of land zoned for certain types of housing. And so even though you've got sort of enough right now in our sort of base case 20-year housing need projection, if your population grows faster than that, you won't have enough. So I think this is something that's important to look at. And the strategy here would be some combination of rezoning land from some lower density residential designations to a higher density designation, coupled with maybe some of the other things we'll talk about in terms of increasing allowable housing density for certain types of development or establishing minimum densities. We haven't identified specific areas for rezoning, and that was one of the questions that TAC asked us, is that something we'll do or can we do that? And the answer is yes, we can spend some more time to be a little more specific about locations where we think this would make some sense. So that will be kind of a next step in the process on this one. So I'm just going to keep plowing along unless you raise your hands or talk. But if you do that, then I'll stop and just see what the comments or questions are. So second one of these in this category, UGB expansion or adjustment. Really, frankly, the findings of our earlier analysis don't support this in kind of that 20-year time horizon It's not to say if you grew much faster than those growth projections indicate that you might not need to look at this in the future. But right now, even under sort of an alternative higher growth scenario, we're not seeing the need for a UGB amendment in the short term, or even probably the middle term. But it could be something you need in the longer term. And you definitely want to kind of keep your eyes on this, keep your eyes on kind of the supply of land and how you're doing in terms of being able to meet those future needs. But right now, we identified this as a relatively low priority, given what we found in the analyses we've done so far.
Hey, Matt.
Yes.
Paul Strobel here. Got just a comment and a question. I agree on this one being a low priority. That makes sense to me. I agree with the findings there. I had a question on the first bullet point that you've got on here. Consider and adopt efficiency measures to ensure the land inside of the UGB is being used efficiently. Is that basically what you're recommending throughout the rest of the analysis here then?
Yeah, pretty much. So 2 quick things on that. One, before any city moves forward and recommends amending their UGB, they are required by the state to, the word is consider, ways to use land within the UGB more efficiently. And so if you were ever to get to that point where you wanted to, you had the justification to pursue a UGB amendment, first you'd have to evaluate or consider these efficiency measures. And I would say most of the things that we identified in here, those are the things the state would identify or define as efficiency measures. So if you move forward and do these things, you will have sort of already done that, or
right.
to a very large degree. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Any other questions on the first couple? Okay. So next one, now we're kind of get into the policy and development code strategies bucket of things. There's quite a few of them in this topic or under this category, but I'll walk through these. And a number of these were identified as higher priorities. And so when you see the little green speedometer looking thing down there, that's pointing towards a high priority. So increasing allowed density in some of your existing zones. This is something we think is important, particularly the multifamily zone. We think that you could, the densities that you allow there are fairly low for a multifamily zone, and increasing some of those allowed densities is going to make it more financially feasible to develop multifamily housing in that zone in particular. We also think that you should look at increasing allowed density or really kind of reducing minimum lot sizes in some of your zones, particularly for some of the middle housing types. And I'll talk about that under another strategy, but it's a related strategy. Those two are kind of coupled. And again, this is to reduce cost and improve financial feasibility of development for those types of housing. This is something that came out of both some economic or pro forma analysis that Johnson Economics on our team did around this, as well as the developer interviews that I talked about earlier. We've got some pretty specific recommendations for density levels or lot sizes within that housing strategies report. So this one we think is a relatively high priority just based on what we found in terms of reviewing your development code, talking to folks and doing some financial analysis of what it takes to build those forms of housing here and in other places. Yeah, Jerry.
So we did this in another development recently, and it didn't really work out. We didn't get more affordable housing. We got the same houses built on the smaller lots that we got built on the normal regular lots that we, and it just backfired. So are there ways that we can structure this to where it'll, be more definitive that we're going to get smaller houses, affordable houses, that stuff? I mean, it just seems like it, since it backfired on us last time, I don't want to take the chance that it, the same thing's going to happen again.
Yeah, so let me say a couple of things and then I'll take Joel's question after that. So first, we're not recommending this so much for your single family detached housing for that type of housing on those lots. This is really more aimed at multifamily housing or apartments, middle housing, so duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, because your lot sizes for those types of housing are at a size where those those aren't going to get developed. I mean, it just takes too much land to develop them, given what it costs and sort of what the market is for those. So this is not really aimed at your single family detached homes. So we are recommending you do this in some of your zones sort of across the board, not just for, and really in part, yes, it's to reduce cost and improve the financial feasibility of developing these types of housing, just to see more of it get built to some degree. Doesn't guarantee they're going to be at a certain price point or affordable to people with a certain income. I will talk a little bit more later about some potential, another way to think about this, which is incentives, which can include some of the same types of things that I'll talk about generally, but incentives that you provide to developers in exchange for the homes being affordable to a certain percentage of the population or to people with certain income ranges. So that's definitely another tack you can take, and I'll talk about that too. But I will say this is less oriented to kind of single family detached homes on smaller lots and more to some of those other housing types. But really good question. And that was something that came up in our TAC meeting too. Yeah, Councilor Dunsmuir asked exactly the same question for us there. So yeah, thank you. Joel, did you have a comment or a question as well?
Yes, thank you, Matt. So along the lines of what Jerry had said there, and I appreciate your response to that. But I mean, if you look at some of the responses that did after, kind of seeing what happened with some of the lower density housing and lower density, the lower lot sizes, and we had lowered previously and it just built the same size houses on there. I wouldn't look at some of the other cities, and that's actually a common response because the incentives for the developer is more houses per property. They already got their incentive, so those other incentives don't matter as much to them because we've already built their incentive in, lower cost of land per house provided. So some of the things I've seen some other cities do, and I wanted to get your take on it since you're kind of in that field, is they've started building things into their building code. It basically requires that after so many houses or so much development space that they're required to build, like duplexes, triplexes into the neighborhoods and things. And so it's different cities had different takes on how they did it, but they built it in there. So it's in order for a development to come in, we already know that if they're going to build, I don't know, 300 homes in a development or whatever, and it's going to be X amount of acres, that there's going to be so many multifamily dwellings because it's going to be built into the code of a requirement for them to build so many triplexes, duplexes, sorted and kind of salted into that development. So I want to see what your take is on that. I saw a few places. I think they had something kind of like that over, and I want to say Happy Valley is one of the places I saw they had something like that in there, and there's a few others I've heard about too. So
yeah, so that is one route you could take potentially for larger developments. I think for kind of smaller developments or infill developments, it's probably pretty challenging to make that work. For developments over a certain size, potentially, as long as your standards around that are clear and objective in terms of how you regulate that could be another tool we look at. We worked with the city of Dundee to adopt some updated development code or zoning recommendations for residential areas there. And that was actually one of the things that we did there, was to require that a certain percentage of housing in they just had one residential zone essentially. So they didn't have kind of an R3 or higher density zone and a middle density and a lower density, just in our zone. And so we did in fact require that a certain percentage of homes be not just single family detached homes, be other types of housing, whether it was duplexes, multifamily apartments, et cetera. So I think that's something we could explore as sort of an alternative or additional strategy. It's probably not going to be workable for every type of development, but it could potentially be for some. So I'm going to say, let's take a look at that kind of as a follow-up to this. Yeah, Paul.
So I was going to ask that question in a different way. Matt, what would the strategy be to keep it from being a group of very small homes or smaller homes on small property? We want the multifamily or the triplex, quadplex, something like that, right? That's the goal of number 3. How do we encourage
So-
that to happen?
You know, in terms of sort of the size of homes, there are some different types of standards you can incorporate in your code if that's sort of a concern in terms of, well, people just build bigger homes on smaller lots. There's sort of two typical standard. Well, there's a few typical standards you can use to address that. One is setbacks. I think your setbacks are already pretty reasonable. 2 is lot coverage, and 3 is something called floor area ratio. And that really kind of helps govern the mass of a home on a given lot. So if that's a concern, that's something. And we actually did talk about considering incorporating floor area ratio. It's not something you guys typically do now, but you could look at doing that. So that's one kind of thought on that. Yeah, beyond that, again, in these zones where we're talking about changing the requirements, it's really not so much to reduce the lot size requirement for a single family detached home. It's more to reduce it to a reasonable level for duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. But if the concern there was that we're potentially going to get these large buildings that were out of scale with surrounding houses, then some combination of setback, lot coverage, and floor area ratio, those standards would help address that concern. Does that make sense? It's kind of, it's easier to show that with some pictures, but I don't have any good ones for you right now.
That helps. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts on this one before I kind of jump to the next one? All right. This next one, establish minimum density requirements. This is something we would typically focus more on in a higher density zone. And the reason for doing this is that if you allow in, let's say, a higher density zone, if you allow development of single family detached homes, then somebody can easily come along and that's the kind of development they'll do. They might end up doing sort of a bunch of whatever size single family detached homes on quite small lots, but you don't necessarily get the multifamily or the apartment or the higher density homes that is kind of the purpose, frankly, of that zone. And so one way to deal, and then what happens is if you have a small amount of acreage that's kind of available for that form of housing, it gets eaten up by another form of housing that could already be developed somewhere else. But if you're allowing it to be developed in your lower density zones and you don't have some minimum density requirements, then that's a potential issue. So because you do have a limited supply of land in that R3 zone, we think this is something you might want to look at. And we identified some ranges of density minimums you could apply in these zones. And really, again, it is more about kind of funneling certain types of housing into those zones and not having that land consumed by lower density forms of housing to the point where you run out and then you got to go out and rezone. We might want to rezone anyway, but maybe not have to do as much of it down the line. So does that, yeah. And I guess, yeah, I don't have too much more to add on this. Again, it's really more around kind of the higher density zones than the lower medium density zones. So, all right. And now when we identified it as a relatively high priority, again, because of the relatively limited capacity of the higher density land that you have right now. So the other one was facilitate missing middle housing types in all residential zones. You can kind of decide kind of how far you want to go in your low and medium density residential zones on this. Definitely most cities kind of medium residential zone. That's the intent, is to have more of a mix of these housing types. And this was definitely something that the Chad recommended in their work, was to kind of move toward some of the requirements, at least for smaller communities, that came out of what's called HB 2001 or House Bill 2001. We had some pretty good support in the online survey we did for kind of expanding the range of middle housing options available. And again, kind of see what I mean when I say middle housing over there on the right side. So the recommendation here is rather than to either not allow for or to make these types of housing conditional uses and have to go through that conditional use permit process to build them, We recommend permitting most of these by right in at least most residential zones. You could, again, you may decide in your lowest density zone, you don't want to allow for all of these outright, but at least in the medium density zone, we would recommend it. And then just to kind of reduce some of the barriers that I talked about a moment ago, and I'll talk about a little more, which is tied to required lot sizes and or parking requirements. Those are kind of the two biggies. And making sure, and this is just sort of something, frankly, you have to do, but making sure that any design or development code standards you have are considered clear and objective. They're measurable standards. They don't allow for discretionary decisions. So that's really important. And that can be a pretty significant barrier to developing housing as sort of a discretionary set of standards or process for review and approval of a development. So again, given sort of the identified need for a wider range of housing types, and then they're not currently being built at very high levels there, this one ended up being a higher priority in our list of strategies. So, yeah, Paul.
I just wanted to chime in on this one. This one makes sense to me. This one seems like a great idea. And then just for clarification, this is recommended for not necessarily the low density zones, correct? But more the middle density zones.
I would say more for the middle.
High?
I would say more for the middle, but I would say, at least duplexes, I think would be worth considering allowing your low density zone, and maybe even duplexes, triplexes. I've talked to a number of communities where they say cottage cluster housing, which is kind of that photo on the right bottom of the group, can be a fairly appropriate type of housing for those lower density zones, because those are sort of smaller individual homes that are clustered around a common open space. So I think ultimately you need to just kind of look at these and say, hey, these are the ones that we think even in the low density zone might make more sense, because that's where a lot of your land supply is. So if we're trying to increase housing variety generally in Estacada, then I think in as many of these zones as you're comfortable with and support, I would consider allowing some or most, or in some cases, all of these middle housing types.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good question. All right. The next one's about promoting accessory dwelling units. So this is something you already allow. And I'm going to take a really quick step back to the comprehensive plan policies, because there was a question from the TAC when we were talking about those, because a lot of those are around just having policy language that support the things I'm talking about today, and also things you already do. And I wanted to be clear that those policy updates are just to add sort of additional foundation and support, and recognize that you are doing a number of these things. So I just kind of back to that stuff, which I didn't talk about in much detail. I didn't want to lose that comment from the meeting with the technical advisory committee. But there are a few things you could potentially do within your development code to sort of further encourage or allow for, well, not allow for, but encourage and make it easier to develop accessory dwelling units. You could allow for some exceptions to your rear yard setbacks. I don't remember offhand what that setback is, but in a number of communities, they'll allow for a smaller rear yard setback for an accessory dwelling unit, particularly if it's below a certain height. If it's just one story or below, say, 18 feet or 15 feet in height, so that having it closer to the rear lot line doesn't feel as, I guess, intrusive. So that's something to think about. Consider some exceptions to your lot coverage standards if somebody's building an ADU, if those would be prohibitive. You need to kind of clarify that ADUs, you can't require a parking space for an ADU directly. There was a question in the TAC meeting about, well, what if the house doesn't have an off-street parking space and then they want to add an ADU? Can we require one that's basically for the existing house? Maybe. I still need to kind of check into that, but you can't require one specifically for the development of the ADU. And your code to us wasn't totally crystal clear on that. So we just think, let's make sure that that is clear and that you're meeting the state requirement there. You could consider allowing 2 ADUs, for instance, on one property, like an internal, somebody's got a basement apartment plus an external accessory dwelling unit. And you have a few design standards for accessory dwelling units that we think you probably need to revise to make sure they are clear and objective. And we pointed those out in the memo in a little more detail. If you want to go sort of beyond those development code related strategies for ADUs, you could think about applying system development charge reductions or deferrals for them. And or another strategy that a number of communities I've talked to are using is to provide and have some pre-approved site or building plans specifically for ADUs. So it's just easier for somebody to come in and submit an application for one. And if it looks like one of those pre-approved site or building plans, you allow that application to go through more quickly. So those are a couple kind of non-code things that you could think about on ADUs. And again, just in terms of expanding housing variety of choice, we identified this one as a relatively high priority. So questions about that? Does that generally make sense to folks? Okay. All right. This next one is sort of builds on some of the other things we talked about really in a way, but it's focused on, and this was one of the recommendations that came out of that CHAD, was to particularly encourage a diversity of housing types in what they described as high opportunity neighborhoods. Generally, we think about those as areas with good access to jobs, shopping, schools, other services. In particular, they noted thinking about doing this in the R1 areas, the lower density residential zone areas that are near uptown and near the downtown and or near schools. So the way to do this potentially would be to focus some of the strategies that I have already been talking about, and we'll talk about in the next couple slides, specifically in those areas. So rather than maybe take just a blanket approach, maybe you provide some additional changes in some of your development code standards in those areas to promote that diversity of housing types in places close to where people have services. So that's another one, again, just based on the CHAD recommendation that we identified as a higher priority. We still need to kind of flesh this one out in a little more detail as part of our next steps. And part of that is being a little more specific about the where. So I will admit that we haven't gotten too specific about the where, other than just kind of the general recommendations from the CHAD at this point. All right. Thanks for being patient with all my talking tonight as well. And do keep interrupting me if you have questions or comments. So another one that always garners a lot of discussion, I would say, particularly in a community meeting or a neighborhood meeting, is around reducing off-street parking requirements. So I would say you guys already have what I consider pretty good, pretty reasonable, and I'd say, let's say financially feasible off-street requirements for multifamily. You just require 1 space per unit in those cases for that type of housing. You currently require 2 spaces per unit for single family, detached homes and plexes, duplexes, triplexes, as well as common wall or townhomes. And to some degree, those can pose a barrier to financially feasible development of those housing types. So as part of that House Bill 2001 project I mentioned earlier, for cities that need to comply with those, for larger cities, they actually need to reduce their off-street parking standards to 1 space per unit. That's for cities over 25,000 people or within the Portland metro area. You guys are not, not those cities. But I would still say it's worth thinking about reducing some of those off-street parking requirements, either citywide or in possibly those high opportunity areas, or in exchange for some kind of dedication or demonstration that the developers are going to build housing units that are affordable to people in a certain income range. So this is one that you could decide kind of where and how you want to apply it. I'll say that one of the questions that came up in the TAC meeting was, Well, what about going to, instead of all the way down to 1 space per unit for middle housing types, 1.5 spaces per unit? I think Melanie might have asked that question. I can't remember. Maybe. Anyway, so that's a possibility. It's a little harder. It's a little harder to do 1.5 spaces per unit for townhouses, because those are homes on individual lots and you can't really create half a parking space unless they have some kind of shared parking area. But for like a triplex, you could require either 4 spaces for all 3 units or 5 spaces for 3 units. You could do something similar for quadplexes. Definitely for cottage cluster housing, you could go to like 1.5 spaces per unit. They just get averaged out over the development. So that's where you could go if you wanted to reduce it from 2 for those types, but not go all the way to 1. And definitely we hear in almost every community where we talk about this, some concerns about impacts on street space and crowding of parking along the streets. So I'll stop there. Joel.
Yeah, and I see the benefit of what you're talking about, but the one challenge that I see is that we're already trying to shave off space on the roads, making them thin. So if we're removing parking requirements, especially for like single family homes where we have these thinnest roads, that they're going to be pushing more cars onto the streets, which is going to make that even harder. So there's got to be some sort of balance, and they were suggestion there between either thinning the streets down that they're trying to do, or leaving more parking for the individual homes, or basically so people that do have 2 cars in America are known for having 2 vehicles quite often. But or keep the roads wider so that if we're going to put more people onto the street parking, that we can accommodate that. But it's like if we go for both, I can see that just being a disaster in the long run. So
yeah, and I don't disagree with you. I'd say you probably, and frankly, for single family detached homes, you could reduce that number of spaces as well. And in most cases, a builder you're still going to get 2 spaces, because you're probably going to have a garage and you're going to have a driveway. And most places, that's what you're going to end up with, even if you allow them to provide fewer spaces. And this is less of an issue, frankly, for single family detached homes than it is for a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex that's on a somewhat smaller lot. Because when you end up trying to build one of those, let's say it's a quadplex, that's 8 off-street spaces for that quadplex. That starts to really eat into the amount of space you have on the lot for the home. And it starts to really impact the financial feasibility of that type of development. And that's why, in part, we're saying, think about, for some of these middle housing types, reducing the number of spaces that you require off street. And I think, yes, you still, if you had a whole neighborhood of quadplexes or triplexes or duplexes, you would still start to run into potentially the problems you talked about. But if these are more part of a development and a smaller part, it might not be as much of an issue. So again, I don't disagree with you, but I would say think about it for some of those housing types. But yeah, go ahead.
Jumping in on that, I would agree with Councilor Lickey's comments, just the concern about overcrowding the streets. And then, as you said, Matt, this is one that makes people bristle when it comes up. Something that would help if we're going to consider that is maybe what other cities do to help facilitate that, having common parking areas, whatever it would be, but to have some options that we could consider along with that. And then real quick, bouncing back to number 7, I just think that's in theory a great idea. Look forward to hearing more thoughts on that going forward too.
Great. And Joel, yeah, did you have something to add?
just a quick comment. So something for us to consider then, I think, as we're looking at some of our housing ordinances and stuff in the city, and those building requirements, is when we start looking at the requirements for the road widths and the parking spaces, we might need to find some sort of balance in the zoning and the minimal width of the roads, or something where we can rebalance those type of requirements out. So that way, if it's where it's going to be a higher residential zoning, where we're going to have fewer off-street parking, that we know we have to have wider roads in those no matter what, because it's going to push people onto the street. And so that might be something, just as a side note, for us to think about as we move forward.
Yeah, I think good thought. And you all are getting close to starting up an update of your transportation system plan, I understand.
I was
So
just gonna
that's,
mention that. Yeah, good timing.
I beat Taylor to it. Sorry, Taylor. But that's coming up. So that's one of the places where you would look at those road standards. Then the other, I'll just say one more quick thing in response to Paul's comment. And that is that there are some things you can do to try to retain a little more space for on-street parking. So you can require shared driveways or tapered driveways. So you maintain, you reduce the width of curb cuts and retain a certain amount of space on street. If you are having somebody develop in an area where you allow for narrower lots, you can require that they maintain a certain amount of space between driveways, so at least you have space for a car between them. So there are a few things that you could look at in your code to address those things in terms of at least maintaining a certain amount of space on street. And I think, Joel, thinking about wider streets is the other thing to think about. There's trade-offs on all of these things, but yeah, good thoughts on all that. All right, I'm going to jump to the next one. This one, facilitate development of non-conforming lots. This was something that was identified as a strategy by the CHAD. And the point here is just to make sure that if your required minimum lot size is 5,000 square feet, but somebody's got a vacant 4,500 square foot lot, that you still allow them to develop a house on this. And I think that's generally a good, you almost have to do that to a degree, because if you don't, then that homeowner has lost all or most economic value from the property, and they can sue you for a takings claim. And I won't go into too much detail on that, but it is a risk. So I think just from a practical and financial standpoint, this is a good policy. And you could think about doing that not just for single family dwellings, but potentially allow duplexes in those areas as well. And you can also make sure that if you're allowing development on those non-conforming lots, that you're making sure that they're still meeting infrastructure needs, that allowing for development on those small lots isn't compromising the ability to provide infrastructure in those areas. But I think generally good strategy from the CHAD on this one, and we would tend to echo it. And again, I think it'll help keep you out of trouble in some cases as well. So, and it's pretty typical. Most communities that I've worked in do allow for development of at least one home on those smaller non-conforming lots. In most cases, there can be cases where you don't, but it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, and I'll just tag on to that is just the consideration that currently we have lots much smaller than those. I think those are 4,000 square feet. But, I think in the Faraday Hills subdivision, we've allowed lots as small as 3,400 square feet, and they are allowed to put an ADU in those homes too. So, just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it can become kind of a fairness issue too if you're allowing that in some zones but not others. So, all right, this next one, this gets it. I talked about this a little bit before. So this is sort of gets, I think, to Jerry's question earlier about, in some cases, if you're giving somebody something and you want something in return, how do you make sure you get the thing in return? So you could target some of the strategies I've talked about, or target kind of going even beyond those strategies in terms of reducing minimum lot sizes further, reducing parking requirements, whatever it might be. You could tie those to requiring that those developments be affordable to households in a certain income. And it could be that you require all of the homes in that development or all the units in that development to be affordable to folks in those income ranges, or at least a certain percentage of them. You can't just sort of in a blanket way require that for every development, a certain percentage of homes are affordable to people in a certain income range. That's called inclusionary zoning. And for the most part, it's not allowed in Oregon. It is allowed under very specific conditions, which are very difficult for most smaller communities to meet. The only city that's doing that in Oregon is Portland. And in most places, I tell people it's not really it's kind of not worth your while to pursue it. But as an incentive, or in exchange for allowing for more units, less parking, taller buildings, whatever it might be, then I think it's a good incentive. And then it does sort of tie the development to providing that community benefit of the housing being in a certain price range and affordable to people in certain income ranges. So I think that one thing we said here is, if you're going to do this, we would suggest, and we can help with this, a little more consultation with local affordable housing providers to figure out which incentives are going to be most important or most meaningful or most beneficial to them. So we could dig a little deeper on this one. If this is something you think makes sense, we identified this as a kind of relative priority medium, but I think still worth looking at. So any questions or comments on this one?
I have a quick comment, Matt. This is Melanie. We have about 15 minutes left that we scheduled, and I know we'll probably run over a little bit, but I was going to say, since the rest of the strategies are kind of medium and we kind of made it through most of the high priority ones, that I don't want to stop anybody from commenting or you from explaining, but I thought we should probably just, you can talk faster if you want. It's okay.
I will try to talk even faster.
Okay.
And some of these I'll have less to say on, but I'll just keep working through them and we'll see what we can do. And I guess if we don't get through them all, and you've got a copy of the report, I can send out a copy of the presentation, and you can always sort of follow up with comments after the meeting to Taylor and Melanie, and they'll get them to me. So, all right. So this one I'm not going to talk too much about because I've really talked about this in the other slides. This is reducing unnecessary barriers. It's really kind of all the things I already talked about in terms of potential changes to your development code. Things around minimum lot sizes, parking, setbacks, et cetera, requiring a conditional use permit process. All of those things can present barriers. So I won't go into this anymore because I think I've really kind of covered it. And medium priority, I would call it medium to high, because some of the things specifically I talked about are higher priorities. Systems development charge exemptions or deferral. So now we're kind of still in the incentives bucket, and then we'll talk about some other funding things. This is kind of overlaps with funding as well. There's a couple things you can think about doing here. One is reducing fees for particular housing types or tying the fee to the size of the housing. Now that's something that would require, frankly, going back and relooking at your systems development charge methodologies, but that is something that a number of cities around the state have done. Or you can reduce or defer SDCs for certain housing types. You can do that for qualifying affordable housing developments. So again, somebody's building something, they commit to having that be affordable for some extended period of time to folks with certain income levels or at certain price ranges. That's when you reduce or defer or waive the SDCs. A couple other things that Chad talked about was doing that where existing parks are proposed. And then there's also, thinking about tying the SDCs to the amount of parking you require or the amount of parking that's provided. So those were all kind of different ideas around changes or modifications to how you charge or determine the fee for your SDCs. Yeah, Katie.
I was just curious, and I know that you're probably going to go on to the funding sources and programs. Hopefully we've got enough time to cover that. But in a lot of cases, the SDCs are the only source of funding that we have to do things like capital projects or, other projects that are going to be needed throughout the city to help the infrastructure keep up with the growth. So in the cases that you're recommending, essentially reducing or exempting certain development from SDCs, knowing that we're still going to need that capital to fund the growth of infrastructure that's going to be necessary to accommodate the growth. How are we going to be able to afford that as a city if we're going around and waiving or reducing SDCs for developments where we ultimately need that money to help grow the infrastructure that's needed to keep up with the growth?
Yeah, so great question. I'm going to try to be quick because we're down to 11 minutes, and I will, if we get to construction excise tax, I'll say something about it there. So a couple things. One, yes, this would have an impact on your SDC revenues. If you were to update the methodology, and tie the rate to the size of housing, you wouldn't necessarily lose any gross or net revenue from SDCs. You would just kind of distribute the costs by housing size. So somebody's building a bigger house that's going to require, frankly, more water, more wastewater, more transportation services. They're going to pay a slightly higher SDC. Somebody's building a smaller unit that requires less, they're going to pay a lower SDC. So that one wouldn't necessarily take it away, but that's kind of a strategy that would require updating your methodology. And then in terms of kind of ways to backfill it, probably the most likely funding source for that would be a construction excise tax. That's at the very end, I think. So hopefully I get to that in the next 10 minutes. But yeah, good question. And we can say more about that later too as a follow-up, but that's what I'll say for now. So tax abatements or exemptions. There are a number of different tax abatements or exemptions that are authorized by the state. You have already adopted the vertical housing development zone in your downtown, and that's one category of exemptions. The CHAD recommended specifically the home buyer opportunity limited tax exemption, which encourages home ownership for low and moderate income families in certain areas. So that's one to think about. There are a couple other ones that are tied to low income rental housing or multifamily housing. The thing I'll say about these is, I mean, they do have a similar impact to what Katie talked about. They reduce long-term revenues from those taxes. They are really essential for developers of housing that's affordable to very low or low income, or sometimes even moderate income households. I hear from those folks all the time that they are one of the things that helps those things pencil out. So I think, and this can be done either sort of, you can have a general ordinance that says, we're going to apply this if somebody comes along and requests it, and they meet all the requirements, all the criteria for this, or you can do it on a case-by-case basis as someone comes to you and requests it. So I think we said medium priority. I would call this one kind of medium high, other than it takes some kind of administrative work to implement. So you have to decide if you've got the capacity and you're willing to forego a certain amount of revenue. But again, it really is tied to housing that's affordable to certain income ranges and households. So expedited development review. I'll say a couple quick things here. One, this is generally about reducing the time it takes to get through development review, or just making it somewhat easier. The CHAD had recommended expediting permitting for certain city supported projects and those that provide long-term affordability. You already have to do that to a certain degree. There's a state requirement that for qualifying development applications, you reduce it from 120 days max to 100. So you could potentially further reduce that. One of the things that Taylor talked about when we met, hopefully I get this right, is that in the downtown area, you have both standards, but also review by a design review committee. So one way to kind of streamline permitting review there would be to say, hey, we're just going to use the standards. We're not going to have people go through the design review committee process. So that's another option. One of the ways some places do this is assign a staff person to kind of help, projects get through there. You guys don't have a whole bunch of, you don't have a staff of 20 planners. So sort of assigning one person, like practically speaking, for a city your size is a little more of a challenge. So, this one is not without its sort of staffing and capacity challenges, but it was something that came out of the CHAD recommendations that we wanted to mention. All right. Financial assistance programs. Couple ways to think about this. One, I'm going to say three ways. One is sort of just generally providing some kind of funding that helps people with the monthly or annual costs of owning or renovating their home or paying their bills. So rent assistance, loans for homeowners, assistance for repairs and upgrades. These are kind of tough things to administer, and communities of your size typically don't administer these programs themselves. The county does administer, and the housing authority administers some of these kinds of programs. And I think our recommendation is, support them in their implementation, or other organizations that do these things. The CHAD had a little bit of a different take on it. And, what they really talked about was just you all as a city providing information sources about these programs that other folks administer. And I think that's a really good idea. The other thing was just kind of looking at eligibility for certain types of funding, such as community development block grants, or other things that are available through the state that can be used by communities like yourselves that are not what are called entitlement communities that get money directly from the federal government. So there's a lot on this slide, but I'll stop there. Yeah, Katie.
Yeah, so I've been an apartment manager actually myself since 2013. I just celebrated my 9-year anniversary a couple of days ago. That being said, I'm curious to know the reason why this is listed as a high priority when it's already extremely inaccessible. If there are programs out there, they are hard to essentially be a part of. A lot of them have wait lists that have been closed. And once you join the wait list, you could be on the wait list for a decade before your name is randomly drawn out of a hat to receive a voucher. And like you were speaking to, we're a relatively small city where we've got essentially 1 or maybe 2 people on staff that we would be able to pick from to say, hey, it's going to be your job to implement or administer these kinds of programs and financial assistance programs. Out of curiosity, why did this make it to the top of the list for the funding sources and programs? It seems to be the only one that's listed as high, and I'm just kind of curious about that.
That is an excellent question, and I don't know that I have a great answer to that question. I would say this might be one where y'all might want to recommend we kind of reduce the level of priority. I think it was identified maybe by the chat as a higher priority, and that could be why. And beyond that, I don't have a great answer for you. I would say that if I was going to think about this in terms of priorities, I think providing information about financial resources or other folks' programs, even if it's tough, getting on a wait list, et cetera, like just giving information is still helpful. And if that doesn't take a bunch of staff capacity, maybe that's a higher priority. Beyond that, I think it's up for you guys to tell us if you think probably shouldn't be at the top of the list. And I don't know, Taylor, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I also don't recall why or how it was prioritized as high, but my assumption would just be that maybe it came from that chat recommendation, and that those specific more doable recommendations from the chat, creating the web page, providing information, those are more accessible to us in our capacity. And so maybe that's where the high priority came in, like, oh, that's something we can definitely do, or more feasibly do.
But I would just ask, like, in general, do y'all think we should lower this to something less than a high priority? Would that make sense to people? So
personally, I just don't see it as effective if we did implement it, which is why I think it should be much lower than it is on the list, personally.
Got it. So Joel's, okay, Paul and then Joel, and then I'm going to move us on. So maybe we get to 1 or 2 more before we finish up.
Sure, just real quick. In theory, it sounds like a great idea, especially if we're just linking resources on the website. So I can see it being high from that standpoint because it would be quick and easy to accomplish. But I'd never really considered what Katie had brought up, that there are wait lists, that these things could be inaccessible as well too. So I guess I would be interested in hearing more about it and just getting an idea of what's out there and how accessible those programs could really be.
Okay, yeah, great thoughts. Joel.
I think Paul actually hit kind of what I was going to say. I can see exactly why this is a high priority, because these are easy things to implement and get done now. And while some of these things may have some waiting lists, like maybe some rental assistance, there's a lot of programs out there, but she's right, they do have waiting lists for some of these. But there's other things like loans for homeowners, and those type of programs are a lot more accessible. And some of this information, having a place that we can point people to with simply adding things to the website is an easy action we can do in a very short period of time to provide that type of information and resource now. And isn't good, shouldn't, if we get prioritizing it done, we can check that box, say we have the resource for them, point people to them in the short term while working on bigger, harder things.
Great. Yeah, I think that'll help us sort of be a little clear about priorities associated with different types of recommendations under this topic. So yeah, I like that. Okay, let's see what I got left here. There's like 4 left. I'm not going to clearly get to all of these, but I'll just hit tax increment financing. And you know what? Actually, I'm going to skip all the way down to construction excise tax. And the reason I'm doing that is because that was something that the CHAD recommended to be a low priority. But I want to respond to Katie's question about, well, how do you pay for some of these things? And just note that that is one of the ways that you can generate revenue to cover, for instance, reductions to SDCs. So construction excise tax is a one-time tax on new construction. The state allows you to impose a tax of between 1% and 3% on that. The state also says if you're going to impose this tax, you have to spend the money on certain types of things. And one of those types of things is on, I can't remember the terminology they use, but it's basically things that are going to reduce the cost of development, including things like SDC reductions or waivers. But I will also say that at the time the CHAD made its recommendations, it did not recommend this one. We identified it as, for that reason, a relatively low priority. And I think our question for you is, should it still be a low priority, or should we think about bumping it up? So Katie's got her hand up, and then see if anybody else has a comment, and then we'll go from there.
Is
Katie.
the only reason that you recommended this as a low priority because of CHAD? That is is that the only reason this is recommended as a low priority?
That was the primary reason we recommended it as a low priority. I would say,
Okay.
had that not been the case, we would have probably recommended it maybe as a medium priority, because it does have some potential benefits. It's not without costs in terms of getting it started. Once it's in place, it's fairly easy to administer. The other, I guess, downside of it is because it's a 1% to 3% tax on all new resident. It can be on just residential construction, or it can also be on commercial and industrial. But it does increase the cost of all housing, and it kind of filters some of that money back into reducing the costs of certain types of housing. So it's not without some drawbacks, but the main reason for it being low was because of the CHAD's recommendation.
I appreciate you giving that perspective on why it was labeled the priority that it was labeled. I do want to share, just to remind everybody, the CHAD committee was made of 9 people that were supposed to represent a diverse group of voices, and the only people whose voices ended up showing up on a regular enough basis to the meetings were the for-profit developers from the people actually building the single family homes, the people who would have essentially had to pay that tax. So I just want to remind everybody that a lot of the recommendations that came out of the CHAD committee should be taken with a grain of salt, and maybe weren't 100% with the directive of increasing the affordable housing, or the low income, or I'm sorry, the lower cost housing, I should say. That is one of my biggest complaints about the CHAD. And that's one of the reasons why I just have to wonder, why we use their recommendation as being a primary reason for addressing a priority level for this one. I would like to see it higher on the list, at least for us as a city to have a greater conversation and maybe some more education surrounding the construction excise tax as well.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Joel, what do you got for me or us?
So with the construction excise tax, you hit some of the pieces on there right away. And I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss any sort of committee that's provided data to us, simply because we have some concerns with it. But so I take in what they said. They made a recommendation. I think we should definitely take that into serious consideration, and they have their reasons behind it. But as far as CET, you hit one of the things on there is that it's going to raise, we already have a highly inflated housing cost here in Estacada because Oregon's inflated as it is. So when you add a CET, it's going to add 1% to 3% already on top of that expensive house, making it even harder for new homeowners and things like that, and younger couples to get into those houses as it is. So it's going to cause, it may be pulling some money into more affordable housing, but at the same time, it's going to cause others strife in their end by having to pay additional funding, because there's no developer is going to eat that cost. They're going to add it on to the home buyer. But you made a good point earlier about SDCs being based on home sizes. That allows us to be flexible in our cost, in our SDC funds. If we have larger homes, single family homes and things that are being on there, then the SDCs come up. If there's a smaller home, then they're smaller. That doesn't reduce our SDCs, but allows it to be more accustomed to the size of home someone's going to be buying. So I thought that gave a lot of flexibility in there with that idea without having to take money actually out and not needing to replace it with something like a CET. And that's just my take on there.
All right. Thanks, Joel. Paul?
I'm between Councilor Dunsmuir and Councilor Litke on this one. I'd be interested in seeing some sort of comparison between construction excise tax and the adjusting the SDC methodology, because they both seem to be somewhat getting at the same thing to some extent. So if there's a compare and contrast, that'd be interesting to see.
Okay. Yeah, we can definitely provide a little more info on both of these. And I see it's 7:05, so I'm guessing we're probably going to need to wrap up and just kind of take comments on these others. As a follow-up, I'll just say thank you for all the comments. This was great. We can definitely move forward and either make some changes to priority levels or just provide some additional information, particularly around some of these trade-offs associated with the strategies that people had more questions and comments or concerns about. So I'll kind of leave it at that. And also just mention that we do have that community meeting coming up next week. So Taylor can continue to get you info on that. And I would just encourage you to encourage people to go to that meeting. Yeah.
Yeah, you want to bring us back to the main screen there, Matt? Can you do that?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll share. Yeah.
I just want to thank you, Matt. You put a lot of valuable information out there, and you gave us a chance to question and answer type thing, and that was wonderful. I think there's a lot out there that we're learning. We are a small city, and there's new things that we can take advantage of. I think having more information on the CETs and the SDCs is probably a smart way to go, so we get a better understanding of how we can work this. But I want to thank you and Taylor and everybody tonight for being a part of this. This is a very important part of our city that we are dealing with right now. So I appreciate all of you. And we're going to go out of this meeting and then we're going to go into the city council, but I want to give you a few minutes for a break. Is that okay? Sadie and Melanie, can we take like maybe a couple minutes?
We actually have a new Zoom link. So we're going to leave this one and I'll start a new Zoom link. So.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right, then I'm going to adjourn this meeting.
Perfect. And if you just want to take 2 or 3 minutes, take a little break. As soon as everybody joins the other meeting, then Mayor can get it started.
Okay, great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
I appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay.